This is a Q Media production.
Leading and navigating change across a business can be overwhelming. So many leaders are handed a project by their board or CEO, and suddenly they're expected to create the vision, inspire their team, navigate roadblocks, and make some really hard decisions. It can feel like you're swimming in the ocean at night, not knowing which way to go. So how is a leader supposed to know how to drive change? The challenge is, there's no course or dummy's guide to leading change. Until now. This is your crash course in leading change, and I'm your guide, Lauren Ryder. In this podcast, you'll learn from top C-suite and executive leaders who've driven impactful change across their organizations. No matter what project you're leading, maybe it's a sales transformation or a restructure or a digital transformation, either way, the approach to leading change is the same. It all starts with an inspirational leader, and that's you. Today's guest is Joseph Vijay, CEO at Intelli Systems. Intelli Systems is an Australian infrastructure services provider supporting critical systems across both IT and non-IT environments. Joseph's career is inspiring. He always pushes for growth, both professionally and personally. He doesn't settle and actively puts himself in positions that make him feel like he's in the deep end. He believes that this is where true growth happens. We discuss his time at Schneider Electric and how his channel background helped find solutions to help grow the business. We also touch on navigating startups, common challenges he's seen across businesses, and practical tips on mentoring, being a leader, and giving constructive feedback. Enjoy the episode. Hey Joseph, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lauren. Good to be here.
So you have had a really long and varied career, from coding to sales to commercial management to GM, and now you're the CEO of a successful data center services company. What do you think has made you so successful?
Well, I think it's just, I've always been somebody who likes to take on a challenge. I'm not one who is very good doing the same thing over and over again, so I think that's naturally made me look out for opportunity. And I suppose I came from an upbringing that said, you know, if there is opportunity, take it. What's the worst that can go wrong? You could screw it up and then fine, you try again. So I think from that point of view, I looked out for opportunity, and when it presented itself, I suppose I was brave enough to take it. That's one thing. But the other thing is, it's not entirely on my own. You know, I think I've been very fortunate. And I didn't, mind you, particularly when I look at younger people today, they're very focused. They understand that through their career, there's a certain formula that they apply. You know, they have a plan. They identify mentors. They go up to those mentors and say, teach me and train me. I didn't have any of that, and I didn't know any of that. But I was fortunate in that people took interest in what I was doing, and they were very generous with supporting, you know, my ideas, or even picking up on some of the things that I could improve on. And unlike, where people have had maybe negative experiences receiving criticism, I think broadly speaking, I had very supportive individuals. So don't get me wrong, they were not afraid of giving me a bit of a smack on the head and saying that was pretty dumb what you did there or what you said there. But I always felt very much supported, so I knew it was coming from a good place. So I think that the opportunity presenting itself, combined with having the right people to support me at the right time, has just helped me go from stage to stage. You said, that I'd gone through coding through to various roles. I suppose the bug that got me was when I had my first role, being responsible for people. I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I suppose from that point of view, then it was very logical. It's what is the ultimate role that makes you responsible for people, and it happens to be called a CEO. So that was a goal that I wanted to achieve, and then it was just what steps needed to be taken to get there. So I'm still learning, by the way. It's one thing to have a role and have a title. It's a very different thing to be good at it. So I'm still on a journey there, definitely.
I think we all are. We're all constantly learning and growing. Now, we actually met, funnily enough, through the data center industry.
Yeah.
So It's a very small industry, as most people in the industry know. So tell me a little bit, how did you get into it?
Well, again, so interesting in, speaking about opportunity. So I used to work for a company called FedEx, and I was in sales, and I was quite successful at what I was doing. And then a recruiter contacted me and said, hey, there's this little company called Harbor. They happen to be doing some stuff in the tech world. And one of the problems I had, one of the things I was trying to overcome is I spent so much time studying technology. I was in FedEx. I didn't feel like I was doing what I'd studied. So the recruiter picked up on that and said, listen, I think you might be interested in this. Anyway, I stumbled into a facility called Global Switch, and I was in awe because there's this aura about walking into a data center when you first get in, just the security, the size, the scale of it, and then the significance of what data centers actually support, which is in effect data, sensitive information, and enabling any business really to operate that relies on technology. So it was a very small company called Harbor. They had 4 people at that time. I was going to be the 5th person. I met these 2 charismatic founders, and we hit it off. And I remember signing the contract, and then my father said, what's wrong with you? Why would you go from FedEx, that's a household brand, to something that nobody has heard of? But I think it was the best move I made, not only specifically for the data center industry, but I think that, when you're trying to go through your career and make change, I think having perspective is really important. So FedEx was very corporate. Harbor was anything goes, and having a combination of those two was, I think, very enjoyable period.
Did you struggle moving from big corporate to startup?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was really hard, and I think it's also what crystallized, how I approach sales. Because one of the things when you're in a large corporate, you could be really good at sales. I'm not taking away from anybody in corporate, but there is a lot that you benefit from the brand, So to an extent, forget anybody else, a lot of my inquiry was inbound because people knew FedEx and they would come in and we were doing corporate work. But when you're in a no-brand company called Harbor, well, you got to pick up the phone and call people. And it was very, very confronting when you said, hi, I'm calling from this company, and they said, sorry, what or where? And that makes you stumble because, you feel like you should be confident. You should come across as same thing goes for when you introduce yourself to somebody brand new. Hi, I'm Joseph. And they go, sorry, what would you say again? And it automatically puts you off. It destabilizes you. So that happened a lot in my early time at Harbor. But I think it's, it's what kind of helps you build those muscles that when you do it often enough, then you expect it and you know how to get past it and you know how to prepare for it. So I'm glad I stuck it out.
Yeah, very much related to change, how you have to just keep on practicing and practicing, get through that
absolutely.
Uncomfortable until you're comfortable.
Absolutely. And if you decide that, I think in those kind of moments, it's really important to know why you made the change. So it was very difficult. It was not easy, and particularly, when you're used to being successful or somebody tells you you're very successful, then suddenly you're put in a situation where you're just not. It's a difficult pill to swallow. But I think the only way you go through that is you remind yourself why you did it in the first place. And would you go back to what you had? And if you just wouldn't, then you got to stick it out. So
you spent quite a few years at Harbor. What was your career progression there?
It was predominantly sales. I suppose I became sales director ultimately, and we went from 5 people to about 50 people.
So that's a huge change to be able to grow a team like that.
Oh, it was not 50 salespeople. The entire company was 50. But I mean, we went. I think towards the end when we went through our acquisition, we were about a 7 or an 8 person sales team, including solutions and pre-sales. So yeah, that in itself. It's not easy when you're inexperienced to manage a lot of people and work through the nuances. So I think that was definitely shaping, and that was definitely eye-opening. But the trajectory was really exciting, and it was really phenomenal. I think partly we had a good business model, but we also, I think, got a little bit lucky in that managed services really started taking off at a time when we were ready to deploy it. So, I think good grace has paid off.
So what kind of change did you drive through that team? Did you take any of the learnings that you had at FedEx to put some structure or a big business process into a small business? How did that work? Because I've definitely worked in both, and sometimes the small businesses don't really like the big business process.
Yeah, it was not so much process, but I agree with you. I think for me, what I was trying to bring to the business at that early stage, what I could rely on, I hadn't gone through, and I suppose if I take a step back, in FedEx, I was a salesperson. So I didn't really, I worked through somebody else's process. And I didn't feel authentic just copying that process. And at Harbour, by the time we built the team, we kind of had a rhythm, you know. So I didn't necessarily think the process was an issue, but I did feel training was a problem. One, I think, very unique experience I went through at FedEx, they had a really strong sales training culture. You know, we went through every week, every Tuesday, without fail, we had 2 hours of sales training. You know, and there was no excuses. It didn't matter if you had a bid or anything else, you had to turn up and you had to actively participate. So I think there was a rigor that came through that, and I went through that for 3 years. So what I tried to do was bring some element of that into how I led the sales team. Not specifically running them through a program, but getting them to think outside of just being reactive to a deal. You know, thinking about prospecting, thinking about doing a little bit of research, thinking about how you'd structure, how you'd plan your conversation. Those are, I think, advantages of being in a corporate, because they drive planning and structure a lot. Like you said, sometimes that can be overbearing, but I think in the right mix, it really works. So if you would ask me if I had to put my finger on one thing that helped us be successful in Harbour, I think it was going from being very shoot from the hip, including myself, by the way, to thinking a little bit more about how we'd structure our conversations and deals.
And did you have to coach people through that?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, thing in a small business, it's good and bad. A large corporate, if where I have in subsequent years, if I had an idea like that, I'd write a business case, I'd go and, get somebody to sign it off, and then I'd more than likely have a trainer or a professional come up and do this. Well, in a small business, you can't do that. You've just got to give it a go. But I think that I couldn't have asked for anything more, because it did two things for me. I felt, and most salespeople, I would argue, go through this. At some point in your career in sales, you go through a little bit of imposter syndrome. Was I really the influencer or the orchestrator of my success, or was I just in the right place at the right time? And when is my luck going to run out? And I think for me, helping or using what I'd learned to teach somebody else, to teach a team, and them using the same principles and then being successful was a validation that actually, no, I'm genuine. This actually works.
Yeah.
So I think I'm glad that it came across. Now, if you interview some of my team, they'll probably have a different version of this, and I'm sure it would have been clunky and everything, but I think we had a good time broadly.
Leading transformational change can be challenging without a community of like-minded professionals where you can learn and practice the real skills of transformation. I am excited to share that Jez Tile has just launched an incredible online global community of transformation professionals. And let me tell you, it is a game changer. It's called People of Transformation, and it's a deep dive beyond the theories, beyond the frameworks, and straight into actionable excellence. It will allow you to shift from problem seeking to opportunity creation and eventually future shaping. So if you're ready to lead the charge, head to peopleoftransformation.com and use the code LEADINGCHANGE at checkout for your special offer. Founding member spots are limited, so don't miss out on this incredible opportunity. So after you left Harbour, where did you head off to next?
Well, Harbour got acquired. So there was a company called NTT, very large telecommunications and services business around the world. They were interested in building a presence in Australia. They had a communications business in Australia, but they were really interested in data centers. They happened to be at that point in time the third largest data center company in the world. And their choice was, acquire or build. And Harbour, NTT actually happened to be a customer of Harbour. We provided colocation to them. So I suppose it provided for a very natural conversation, which led to us becoming NTT. We became acquired. So that in itself was challenging because we went from, a successful scale-up business by that time, but operating very much in our own world, to suddenly being thrust into this, a very enormous company, and trying to work through how we fit in there, and how we transition from being just completely siloed to much more broader. That definitely provided for some learning.
So acquisitions, it's always such an interesting topic to delve into when we talk about change. I'm guessing culture was one thing, how we deal with processes, how we communicate, all of that. What were some of the big challenges that you faced?
I suppose what made it really interesting but also challenging was that through the acquisition, NTT brought three companies together. There was Harbour, which is a managed services business. There was Frontline Systems, that happened to be our parent at the time. They're an IT reseller system integrator. And then they also brought in the communications business. So if you think about it, we had a services business, a telco, and a reseller, all trying to coexist. The decision was made to create one sales team, and that was probably the hardest thing we went through. Now, I didn't have responsibility for the sales team, but I took on a role which was responsible for solutions. So really, if you think about it, architects, pre-sales, commercial people. So we were the kitchen. So the salespeople would go find a deal. We would then work out how to put it together. But that was tough because we were trying to balance out customer demand, keeping some of our legacy business going and keeping that momentum going. But at the same time, trying to firstly find what our new brand meant. Because at that point in time, NTT was not as well known. Today, it's a very different brand. So trying to put our footprint on the market, saying this is what we do, trying to let go of some of the previous narrative and come up with this new narrative that would be inclusive of these three different types of businesses, and then get our sales team to be as comfortable as possible selling all portfolios. I think is the hardest thing. I would never try and do that again, by the way. But that was a hard thing.
So what were some things that really worked well in that? Because it sounds like it was quite a complicated program. Very complicated.
But I think there was a very strong, I think it was a pretty good culture in that, both Harbour and Frontline, definitely we'd worked together, but we'd still not collaborated as day to day. There was engagement, but we didn't have to worry about each other's businesses. But I think we came from the same place. It was do a good job, try and keep it as simple as possible, and have some fun while you're doing it. So I think that did continue. That did help smoothen out some of the rough edges. But at the end of the day, typically, if you're trying to, in my opinion anyway, if you're trying to solve a problem, but there is a lot of purpose around solving that problem. So to put it into context, we had a lot of demand coming in, So there was, I suppose from a sales point of view or a business point of view, I don't think there was a doubt that we were relevant. We were very relevant by virtue of the demand coming in. We just had to get really good very quickly at doing a good job of it. So I suppose while there was hardship and there was challenges, that constant influx of inquiry made it feel like it was worth it. It was worth doing. And I think that's, if I think about how do we manage through that time, I would say that was probably, the number one thing.
So really keeping that spirit up.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I revisit that time and I thought, oh God, say we had that same situation, but then we had no sales inquiry, say it was completely flat, or we were in a different time in the market where it was soft, that would have made it harder, I think, because we would have been not only having to go through that change, but we would have had to try and tell ourselves this is still worth doing in spite of not getting the inquiry. So I think that would have been a harder thing to go through. But fortunately, we didn't have to worry about that.
Good. So after you left NTT, where did you head off to?
Somebody from Schneider reached out and said, hey, we're trying to make this business pivot, and you seem to have an interesting background. We'd like you to apply for this role. So I thought it was a good thing to do. Schneider's always been a brand that I suppose if you're in the data center industry, you know of that brand very well. So they've always been a brand that I aspired to. I really like their culture and their values. So I thought it might be a nice next step. And most importantly, it was something that I'd, again, never done before. I'd never been part of a vendor before. I'd never done anything to do with channel-related selling. And I'd never had anything to do with product. I was more of a services guy. So I thought the fundamentals there made sense. If I was going to broaden my perspective, then this is one way to do it. And that's what came about.
So they called you, they said, we'd like you to pivot this business. What was the challenge that they were facing, and where did they want you to take it?
Well, APC has been a very, very successful brand for many years. But they had two things that they wanted to do. They wanted to, and they've always been, by the way, very connected to the IT fraternity. It's in fact their unique differentiator. Their competitors typically pivot more to the non-IT side of things. APC was always very close, and they wanted to hang on to that, and it was very important. So in their mind, bringing somebody like me on who comes from an IT channel background might give them a perspective on how to address this market a little bit more directly. And that's what I set out to do. So that part of it was more of they had a really great base. They had a really great program. It was about tweaking it. It was about trying to find, efficiencies, trying to find enhancements, if you like. What was really interesting, though, is while APC had a really solid following for the IT channel, some of their competitors actually did much better on the non-IT side, so the electrical industry. I didn't feel like we were addressing it well enough. So really, for me, the opportunity there was to say, hey, have you thought about why this is the case, and is it worth putting something in place to try and attract that market a little bit more consistently? It's a difficult market, admittedly. It's a very fragmented market. But in terms of raw numbers, and this is the economics that made sense to me, there are roughly about 15,000 IT resellers, service providers in Australia. In contrast, there are 45,000 electrical businesses in the same geography, 3 times the size. So I thought, look, we've got to be more proactive in that space, because there's got to be a market share that we can go for. And I think that really paid off. It was a dual. So we went through, when I say pivoting, I think that word is appropriate, because it's not a fundamental change to the business. It was, enhancing what they already had, and then trying to put a little bit more structure into how we'd pursue this other market. And I think that worked. So
you led this project. So where did you start?
Look, a long journey, because as I didn't come from this industry. So for me, even trying to understand what was the difference between these two demographics was a challenge in itself. I had some really great colleagues who had spent a lot of time in the industry, and that's the great thing about a company like Schneider, where there's a lot of tenure. So if you're willing to speak to people and you're willing to listen, then there's a lot of people who are willing to give you an idea, give you an opinion, and I really drew on that as much as I possibly could. So for me, firstly, identifying, this idea, is it even valid? Is there a real opportunity here? And it seemed to be. And then I think what compelled the argument was when I looked at where we were losing business to a competitor. A lot of the time we were losing business to competitor because the customer had picked directly a electrical contractor over an IT partner. So if you think about it, the route might have been the customer, IT partner, they subcontract to an electrical contract, and so on and so forth. And a lot of times that worked, except at times when the customer said, you know what, we actually don't need the IT partner, we just go straight. And in those instances, we didn't have an automatic way to capture that business. So that seemed to be the underpinning case. Then you go through the typical validation of, is this worth it, and so on and so forth. But I think, going back to your question, I think it's having an idea and then speaking to enough people to get their perspective on, is this a good idea? Would you do this if it were you? And why haven't you done it so far? What are the things that got in your way? And I think I did a lot of that, and trying to distill under what circumstances could we make this work. I think, form the ultimate plan.
Did you do much customer engagement to test those theories?
A little bit. I must admit, I didn't have as much access. So, if you ask me what would I have liked to have the opportunity to do again, and it's not that by the way, I should rephrase that. It's not that I didn't have access. I didn't prioritize it, But I think a customer perspective is really valid. I think in that instance, I got lucky, in that some of these fundamentals worked, and I think the program stood on its own feet. But a missing piece was really the buyer. Could I go to buyers? Could I form a sample set and say, hey, if we had these kind of partners also on our books, would Schneider or APC be much more attractive? Would it be an easier path for you? Would have been a really great question. I don't think I took the time to do that.
Well, it's all lessons learned, isn't it? So what kind of challenges did you have? Were there challenges getting stakeholders on board, or resistance in your teams? Or was there any part in the process that you kind of going, oh, this is really hard?
Oh, there was a bunch. Because, when you're dealing with a very mature supply chain, there's a lot of things that just work. And you have a lot of cogs in the right spaces. So they just, or gears in the right spaces, if you like. So people know who the distributor is. People know who the market is. There's a marketing campaign that, is tried and tested. There is a message that makes a lot of sense. There's a product narrative that makes a lot of sense. There's an application, and so on and so forth. So I think if I think back to that time, we had all of those fundamentals worked out for the IT space. We didn't have as many of those, easy to access on the non-IT space. How do you address that specifically? There are other parts, by the way, in Schneider that do really well in those communities. It's just APC that didn't really focus on that. So, firstly, when you've got a lot of success, and APC had a lot of success, that's the hardest time to change, in my opinion. It's the hardest time to get stakeholder buy-in. Because people say, why do you want to do that? You've already got all this. There's a whole bunch here that you haven't worked out. Why do you pivot to do that? But I think there's smarter people than me that, talk to. Change is best to plan and manage when you're successful. Don't try and do change when you're not successful, because that is erratic and it's hectic and it's anxious. So I think that was a good lever for me to use, saying, hey, you know what? I think we've got a lot of this stuff worked out. There's going to be incremental success here, but there's going to be an order of magnitude here if we can manage it. Why don't we give it a try? And I think those drivers worked. It also, I think, worked out really well that aside from what we were trying to do locally, globally, there was a push to try and introduce products into that space. So I can't take all the credit for it, definitely not. But I think I leveraged that, to bring those products in. And then the question was, do you think this community is best to sell these types of products, or do we want to go after a different community? Yeah. So we had some strategic direction to go down that route. What was left to us is how would we do it? That was tough doing that because I didn't have a background in it, but I think it was worth doing.
So once you finished up at Schneider, now you made the leap that most people would love to make, jumping into a CEO role. Tell us about how that happened.
Well, I finished up at Schneider somewhat prematurely. I hadn't, I didn't necessarily. I left for personal reasons. My family was going through a really tough time over COVID, and I felt I needed to support them, and I didn't think I could do justice to supporting them while I had, quite a involved role. So hence, I made a decision to leave. But when I left, I didn't have a job to go to. In fact, I didn't plan on going to a role. I took a year off because I wanted to just give my family the time that they needed. And I didn't want to be pressured by any agenda or any commitment. And so there was more opportunity for me to revisit, do I want to stay, retired, if you like, or semi-retired for a period, or should I get back into it? Intelli Systems happened to be a company or a partner when I was at Schneider. In fact, they were the first channel partner that I ever met when I took the gig in Schneider. And what I liked about them was right from the start, they were super honest. They didn't hesitate to tell me warts and all what was wrong with my operation when I was at Schneider. But it was constructive. It was not just a rant. So I got along with them and I followed their trajectory, and they were doing really well. So both the founders, they gave me a call. And funny enough, when they called me, I thought they were going to ask me a question about Schneider, APC, get some help or whatever. But they said, look, we're in a stage now. We've grown quite rapidly. We've got a few different fundamentals, but we might need some help if we need to take the next step. And we really like working with you. Would you consider it? So in all fairness, it was too good an opportunity to pass up. But I blame them for bringing me out of retirement. I was quite happy drinking beer and chilling out. But,
So what was the first thing they wanted you to do?
like most startups, you tend to be quite opportunistic and quite reactive. And they'd identified that, they can only take that approach so far. They wanted a level of sophistication to be introduced into the business. So structure is usually something that a startup will run from because they associate structure with containment, and doesn't have to be that way. So when I joined, I had like a 5-pillar plan, for lack of a better term, just to say these are 5 areas that I think if we address, we're going to create an opportunity or a foundation to scale. Otherwise, we're going to be random. And they were very bought into that idea because they had the idea. So from that point of view, I don't think I had to convince them too much. They were more concerned about, how do we make sure that while doing this, we don't disrupt the culture, because it's a fun culture. People enjoy being together. The last thing you want is too much process and structure, and everybody feels quite restricted. So they were more conscious, and so was I, to make sure that whatever plan we created and however we chose to roll out, that we took that into consideration.
As businesses grow, enterprise change teams are expected to deliver more. But it can be challenging to keep all your company's change planning aligned. Documents get lost or out of date, and executives can't get a clear report on your enterprise change activities. Until now. Change Plan is the incredible connected platform that gives you a powerful, easy-to-use workspace. You'll get all your reporting at a click, an automated front door process, an org chart synced in with your HR system, and the best part, there's portfolio dashboards for leaders. It is the most comprehensive and user-friendly change tool I have seen on the market, and the results speak for themselves. Teams who use Change Plan experience a 30% bump in productivity and up to 50% reduction in change saturation. If you want to see Change Plan in action, head over to changeplan.co/leadingchange to set up an obligation-free demo for your team. How did you approach it? So you've got 5 big pillars, lots to deliver. Was it a big bang, do it all at the same time, or did you have to prioritize? How did you actually structure this? Because you did mention you still had culture to look after at the same time.
Well, I thought the organization part was paramount, and it actually worked really well. That when I spoke to everybody across Intelli Systems, one of the things that came up quite often was, I'm not quite sure where I fit in. I don't know who I report to. When I have a problem, I don't know if I should go to this person or somebody else. So that was an automatic lever, if you like, and a problem that we needed to solve. And it seemed like there was enough buy-in for that. So that was low-hanging fruit. And, I suppose with any change, you want to try and pick up pieces that you could be easily successful in. So, you're kind of buying in, you're getting buy-in from people, but you're also getting people to trust you a little bit more. So there was a vested interest to put some structure into it. What was really important was to show them, what we were changing. Why were we moving from an extremely fluid style of leadership and organization to something which is a little bit more structured. One of the things I was conscious about addressing there was people shouldn't feel like they wouldn't have opportunity anymore. Suddenly you're in a sales team, whereas previously you could be sales, you could be pre-sales, marketing, whatever you wanted. So there it was important to say, look, you need to know what you want to do day to day, but the advantage of being in a small company like ours is if there's a problem, you're willing to put your hand up and solve it, I will never say no, but we're just going to have to work out where what your interests are and what your skill set is, and then we can work it out. So I think having that balance, letting them know that there was still opportunity for them, they didn't have to feel trapped, but at the same time, this would help solve some of the problems they saw in helping them being more agile, never feeling like they're asking the wrong person a question, and that's a tough thing. If you go to somebody and say, "What do you think?" that person tells you one view. You go to somebody else, they tell you a completely different thing. Well, you don't know whose opinion to take. But if I'm able to say, well, that is your manager, and you only take that person's opinion, and I will hold them accountable, from an organization point of view, it makes it easier for them. And I think that was the first thing that we implemented, and I think it went really well. And then it made other more longer term things like brand easier to contemplate.
Did you come across much resistance, people who just didn't want to come on either one or multiple parts of the journey with you?
I wouldn't say they didn't want to come along the journey. I think, change is an interesting thing. I think I've heard this comment being made, some people like change, some people don't like change. I don't necessarily believe that. I think all of us, if you think about it, our DNA is rooted in survival. You can't survive without being willing to change. I think that's a fact. So I don't believe that people aren't willing to change, but I think they have different levels of tolerance for change. So to your question, I think there were some people who were really willing to go for it, just really easy. Yeah, Joseph, that's fine. That makes sense. Let's go. Other people needed a little bit more convincing, and they needed to take a little bit more time. Fortunately, we were in a position where I could give them that time, and I didn't have to force a change very, very quickly. But I don't think I wouldn't say I faced a lot of resistance, no.
Now, at the beginning, you mentioned that you've actually received a bit of feedback along the way, and it sounds like you took it on really well and actually helped you to grow. What kind of tips do you have around giving and receiving feedback?
Oh, look, I've received valuable feedback, period. Some feedback has been nurturing, and I think I've been able to accept that a lot quicker and act on it. Some other types of feedback have been a little bit direct. And I think there, if I'm entirely honest, when somebody gives you criticism that's very, very direct, your ego gets in the way. You put your defenses up. Well, who are you to tell me that? And I think that's important. I've picked from that to try and do things differently, because if my intention purely is to help the person become better, then I've got to make sure I'm speaking in a language that they can understand. If I come across as threatening, or if I come across as too direct or too critical, they're likely to take longer to make change. So I suppose in terms of tips, I think firstly, don't try and provide advice if you actually don't know your stuff. And there's a lot of people who feel obliged to give you an opinion, and it may not be a good opinion. So I think people are really good at working that out, and it doesn't take too long. If you provide, as I said, opinion where you don't really have a base of credibility, then people are going to stop listening to you. So I think that's really important. I think be structured around what you're saying and why you're saying it, and if you really know, then do it. But at the same time, I think earlier in our conversation you talked about empathy. I don't think empathy, at least not for me, I think it's a learned skill. I think, you can constantly develop it. But I think if you're coming from a place where you truly want to see somebody else succeed, even if it's for your own selfish agenda, then empathy, goes a long way. Put yourself in their shoes, see what level they're at, and then try and provide the advice around that.
And what about around the topic of motivation? I mean, I'm pretty sure as you've taken all of your teams through all these changes, people do lose motivation at points in time. What are things that you do to kind of get people back and enthused about what's going on?
Look, I think this phrase "big picture" is either overplayed or underplayed, but I think it has a lot of value, particularly when you're trying to motivate or change. There's got to be something bigger than what we see today. But I think to help people see, look, we're doing something here that nobody's ever contemplated before, or we haven't, at least in our circumstance, done before. Can help them try and build any of the change or whatever that they want to achieve on that foundation. And I think it's important to keep reminding them of that. So we make it a practice to talk through that quite often. Managers talk through it to their teams, and I definitely talk to the managers about it, because I think reminding ourselves that's where we're going. We may not be able to achieve it in the near term, but if we don't keep trying, we're never going to get there. But also, just because I have a great idea or I think it's a great idea doesn't mean everybody else thinks. So I think even there, checking with them, do you still see value in this? Has something changed? Do you still see that this is the best ambition that we can go after, or is there something different? And I think being able to do that with a team is really valuable. Small companies, I think that's the greatest advantage. I can pick up the phone and speak to every one of my team anytime, and I make time for that. Whereas, if you've got a very large team, it's really difficult to do that, and then you're relying on layers to just make that communication. So I enjoy it.
That's good. So to wrap up, one piece of advice that you could give change leaders as to how they can be successful, what would you say?
I think timing. I think pick your timing, because you can have a great idea. You can almost require a must-have change. It might be dire, but I still think if you're trying to make that change at the wrong time, when the people are not ready to make that change with you, then it will fail. So that's I think also the biggest challenge with change, because just because you're ready to make the change, it doesn't mean everybody else is ready to make that change with you, or the market's ready to make that change. So I think you have to figure out how to use the time to your advantage, and that might also lead to topics like motivation or anything else. So I think pick your time is the best thing I can say.
Joseph, this has been great, fascinating. I've loved hearing about your story and views on leadership. Been very helpful for our audience. Thank you so much for being here.
No, pleasure. Thank you for having me.